Can violence be funny?
There's the question as to whether or not it can be funny, and then there's a question whether or not, regardless of its
I think it can
humor,
be funny. That's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
It can be funny.
Should you laugh at it?
Should I laugh? Yeah,
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Welcome back to God Deserves Better, the program dedicated to equipping the saints to create like our Creator. I'm your host, Zach Lovelace, and joining us today is Dr. Dan Kemp, a good friend of mine and current instructor of philosophy and Christian worldview in the College of Theology at Grand Canyon University. Dan specializes in ethics and moral philosophy and is interested in the moral dimensions of film. In fact, he's actually been helping GDB from the shadows, suggesting books and offering notes, insight and feedback with opening monologues, show outlines, and topics as well. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man.
I'm glad to be here.
Of course. In the preparation for this episode, we both circled a lot of topics about what to actually talk about, because you and I can talk forever.
Right.
But we circled this idea of the moral dimensions of film. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's extremely broad. I think that film is something that Americans especially seems to care a lot about. It's something we do a lot in our pastime. I don't know if that's changed in recent history. People are talking about changes in the way that film is consumed and made and so on. But just generally speaking, it's been a fairly stable industry over the last century or so. It's just household
it changes,
activity.
But it definitely is still, you go to the theater or you watch something on Netflix, whatever, you're still watching a film.
Yeah. And I started thinking about this because I read a lot of books, but most of the stuff I read was written in a time well before anything like film was even on the scene. I mean, maybe theater would be the closest example. And you have some writings from thinkers and theologians, more philosophers on the theater, but even then, it's not a whole lot of attention given to it. It's definitely not center stage. But I realized, there's some disjointedness there, like the kind of theorizing that I think a lot about, and a lot of people in my industry think a lot about, doesn't actually affect people's daily habits so much, or doesn't speak to the daily grind of life, except for maybe like one-off issues on animal rights or something, like whether you should eat meat or something like that. That's the kind of thing that you would get, but not a whole lot of attention given to like what is film doing to us? What does it mean to kind of enter into the sort of imaginative sphere that film invites you into, and whether or not there could be duties and moral obligations to fictional entities like characters that don't exist, and so on. And that struck me because the fact that we're not dealing, or we don't talk a lot about this daily habit of an American pastime, because filmmakers often like to think of themselves as doing something important. It's not just making film; it's making art, right? And yet there might be some resistance to thinking about it in moral terms, like is it really good to show this, or is it good to portray the law is corrupt, right? Or the clergyman is corrupt, to reference the Hays Code. Any kind of broaching those questions is moralizing. And yet there seems to be some kind of subtle inconsistency here, so a contradiction where we filmmakers oftentimes think of their enterprise as really important, but not so important that it might importantly affect like people's moral character or the way that they process moral situations.
It does seem a little schizophrenic because they want that. Right. If I'm out here and I'm an activist filmmaker and I'm trying to convince you that, not eating meat is the way to go, I want my film to change the way you view the world morally. And they're imbuing every aspect of their film to try and convince you to do so. The idea that it's neutral otherwise, I think is obviously a myth, just pretty easily dispelled, but people just don't think about that. Right.
And if you think of the way that cinema used to be consumed, your daily show or whatever you watch, Diagnosis Murder every night after dinner, you put the kids to bed and you're watching this show, and every night for 43 minutes or however long it is, you're consuming you're consuming a product that is just dripping with moral significance, because there's a plot, there are characters you're supposed to sympathize with, there are characters you're supposed to not sympathize with. As the plot moves, there is a kind of harmony, status quo that's disturbed, and then the question might come up like, is the resolution of that disturbance of bringing back to the status quo ante, or is it going to be some sort of new status quo? You cannot describe those aspects or those part of even just a plot without using normative language. People need to understand what the characters are doing, and to understand what a character does, you need to understand why what they're doing might be worth doing.
Yeah, what's their motivation?
Yeah, and that is not something that you can do from a purely morally neutral point of view.
Yeah,
neutrality is impossible in that regard.
Now, do you think we've taken it for granted for a long time? We're in a state of cultural decay. I think that's pretty well established and talked about on lots of other podcasts and stuff like that. But the idea that movies aren't what they used to be, that's not just like an old man trope anymore to say that, but there's a veneer that's gone, that it is more moral than ever, if that's possible, because we just said that it's always moral, but it's just more obvious.
You mean that like filmmakers are more attentive to trying, they're trying to be good little boys and follow some sort of moral standard?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably true. But I would it depends on what, I don't know what films you have in mind, but I would
think about stuff like A24.
Okay, so Civil War, did they put that movie
we actually did a review on this podcast about it.
Yeah, I listened to it.
Good that's right, you did. Thanks, man.
But isn't the whole point of that movie that they were trying to be neutral?
Well, that's what, it's so obvious when you're watching it. It's like, but no, you're not.
Yeah.
No, you're not.
You don't think it's neutral?
No, not at all. Not at all. The way
so who's right in Civil War?
Oh,
according to the film,
the journalists are right.
Okay.
Yeah, the journalists are right. So I think that just tells you everything there.
Yeah.
Again, these are like themes and tropes and stuff that are well covered in other podcasts, and other speakers are talking about it, but that the media is right in some way, like the individual. I think on a character level, that I said it all in that podcast, essentially, like Johnny and I really covered that. So if you are interested in Civil War specifically, go check out that episode. But no, I guess the good little boys and girls, I'm saying there are more activist filmmakers nowadays than ever before, because it's, we realize there's the neutrality isn't a thing. They would never admit it.
Yeah.
They would say, like Civil War, oh, it's neutral, but they're just giving you the party line kind of thing.
Yes. So you might think of it this way. This might be, I tried this out this narrative as you're talking. This is something I thought of. Film came into existence and then came of age at a time when intellectually the moral imagination, the moral status quo, the things that people took for granted, that what does a good person do? A good person loves God, loves their family, loves their country, keeps their promises, works hard, and so on. Very, very, maybe doesn't aspire to too much, but has a little bit of a willingness to hustle or something. You can get into detail with what the Western moral imagination would have been, say, in the 1930s. And then, but among the intelligentsia, it's like, these are all just sentiments, hangovers from a theistic, particularly Christian past, and we need to get past that to a new code of ethics, that one that's more egalitarian, that's less committed to particular social relationships, the family, other kind of civic groups and so on. And you might think of a lot of film as contributing to that project of maybe trying to, as an acid, like dissolve the old moral worldview.
We'll get there, yeah.
And now we have this, obviously, a new moral consensus, or at least a lot of our elites want to act like we have this new moral consensus, where there's a certain list of like the worst things that you can be, and then it doesn't really matter if you have no loyalty to, say, the people who raised you, or
it's almost a good to rebel against them. They're just an in-baked oppressive force.
Good example of this is sort of a childish example, but I really enjoyed the first season of The Bad Batch.
The Bad Batch.
It's a animated Star Wars show.
Yeah.
And I've kept up with it just for fun to see if my kids would like it, because it's innocent enough, and it doesn't get as dark as some of the other Star Wars stuff does. That I think they might enjoy it. But the whole thing, The Bad Batch is this clone force that are unique, and it's all about brotherhood, and they take on this little girl who's a clone. There's a little bit of a chosen one element thing going on there. That's kind of corny, but there's some good values. They're all like very devoted to each other and family first kind of thing. And the way that the show ends is the little girl kind of grows up and then leaves the group to go join the rebellion, because it's that.
Oh, so she turns on the group, or because my Star Wars lore is not what it used to be.
Okay, yeah.
The clones became the stormtroopers, right?
Yeah. Sorry, these clones were always rebelling against the Empire.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So she's a part of this like little rebel force or whatever, and she wants to go join the big rebellion. But it's seen as it's not portrayed as she's kind of carrying on what she learned so much as she's going to be her own person. Because I think the modern filmmakers just can't
be yourself.
Help themselves. Like, you cannot be bound or grounded or anchored to another group of people. They have expectations for you, who you would be. Those expectations are necessarily limiting. Like, you don't get to just
don't limit the self. That's the whole liberal mindset. Don't limit the self. I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
My body can't even limit myself.
Yeah.
I'm not shackled by anything. I can be, especially online and VR.
It's so boring.
It's so boring.
It's so boring. And so that's why we have to kind of appeal back to these more old school tropes of, family first, because there's something interesting in that, even though it's so thin. But at the end, they just can't help themselves. They gotta it's gotta be self-determination all the way down.
Yep. That's, man. So you actually brought up the Hays Code a minute ago. For those who don't know, the Hays Code was a set of censorship guidelines the studios from the 20s and 30s agreed to self-impose after they got a lot of bad press for movies that were really risque for the time, with over like lots of violence and sexual content. The pre-code films, and a lot of secular film folks will be like, these are precious films before the code, and they'll show like gay actors and stories and stuff like that, and nudity and whatnot. They're like, and then the Hays Code came in from 34 to 68 and was a very outworking, like, obvious. They were never written down in a way that like the Ten Commandments might say, and just like listed anywhere, but there are lists of them here and there. And I actually pulled some of the original general principles at the top of the code, and I want to read them to you in a second. But just kind of off of that point that we're just talking about, there's this new set of rules that nobody is telling anyone about. You just transgress them. This is the new progressive liberal type thing that you're not allowed to show somebody who wants to be a part of a family. Yeah. That type of thing. Whereas like back in the day, at least the studios came together and agreed, we're not going to show something that transgresses the family.
Yeah. Or what about a young woman who just wants to be a wife and mother, and to not be employed?
So limiting.
You couldn't do it.
Yeah.
In a mainstream film, it just couldn't. You probably couldn't even have one character like that.
You might be able to get away with a supporting character, somebody who's just like, I'm the grandma, and grandma, that's grandma values. Right. It's warm and fuzzy to think about that she wanted to just be home, and I'm glad that she was there, but I'm a working woman who wears pants now. The Katharine Hepburn big controversy for her.
Can I give you another example?
Yeah.
It's a little edgier.
Sure.
But one example that you'll see in a lot of rom-coms of the last 20 years, and not even particularly risque rom-coms, but you'll have a couple, they're like supporting actors, who they're like the stably married couple, and they'll have their like sex night, right? Yeah. Like Thursday night or whatever. It's made fun of. Because it's like routine, and
it's so mechanical. It's so cold that they know they're going to have sex.
Yeah, when you have kids, and the old ball and chain, I guess, as it were. Yeah. Then spontaneity and fun and adventure goes out the window. Yeah. When actually there's some social scientists looking into this, willing to be a little bit independent thinking, Brad Wilcox is somebody who comes to mind, his new book, Get Married, who suggests that actually there might be some evidence that even that particular practice might make people happier in their marriages. And yet it's like a consistent refrain that you get from...
Yeah, it's got to be spontaneous.
Yeah.
It's got to be this, nobody saw it coming.
Yeah.
I met this girl and it was amazing, and it's just, you're being sold. That's the hookup culture thing, that you just are riding on those fumes over and over and over again. You look at these people and they're miserable.
Right.
Even though they basically have sex on demand, spontaneous, if that's even possible. Like you have an app that engineers something that's spontaneous. I don't know if that's actually truly spontaneous anymore. But yeah, these folks are miserable, and I think a lot of people are walking away from it. But to kind of get us back to the Hays Code here, I want to read these general principles and just give you an idea of this is the way the world used to think, and then the way that it thinks now, and you give me your thoughts on each. So they go like this. General principle number 1, no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Standard number 2, correct standards of life subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment shall be presented. General principle number 3, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. We kind of have hit all 3 already in this opening conversation.
Right.
Now, is there anything that you think the modern filmmaker should learn from those 3 things?
I mean, I think it's striking to just consider how nervous people were about this new massively powerful media form, how corrosive it could be to something that they wanted to protect. And there's a lot of skepticism that's thrown back on the past, that people just are scared of what they don't understand. Well, look, the world has changed a lot in the last 100 years, and there are a lot are causes for that. Not all of them have to do...
What's wrong with being scared of what I do understand?
Yeah.
That's really what was happening.
Right. Like this you could now project images so that people could have virtually solitary experiences of those images.
Yeah.
And one person could throw those images out so that everybody within an indeterminate sphere of geographically could have isolated experiences with those images. I mean, I mean, you had the picture before then, but the moving image, that's new.
Well, and especially something with sound, where you're really identifying with a character.
Yeah.
And that's actually something, I quoted it in one of our earlier episodes about Vladimir Lenin, even had his head of the Department of Education or whatever it was for the Soviet Union at the time, on this, and saying that film is our most powerful asset.
Yeah, you could consistently portray business people, for instance, as the ones most likely to, commit very serious white-collar crimes and the least likely to pay their taxes, and whether or not that's true. I know the latter fact's not true, but you could create these impressions such that people don't even know they have them.
Absolutely. And I think there's actually some true criticism that maybe the woke left of today, and unwoke left probably, would say of how certain races were depicted. I think that's actually a part of the Hays Code, where it's no interracial marriages should be depicted.
Yeah,
it's okay, that's we can agree that was bad.
We don't want people thinking that's normal because they recognize the power of it.
Yes.
Which I think that if you look at the people who would kind of laugh at the Hays Code, what would they, wouldn't we want to attribute as a part of the normalization of interracial romantic relationships? Part of that, the responsibility for that is showing it as normal in our kind of
there's a
projected
war on normal now,
imaginations.
I think is what it is. We're outlawing the idea of a normal at all in any way, socially, professionally. We don't want a normal at all. And I think that's where we're ending up. That's not necessarily what they were trying to protect that. You're right with the Hays Code. That now it's to say something normal, that's how I should be. Oh, that's offensive. I don't want to be that way. And I can sympathize with that. Where it's okay, I want to be a writer. And what if it's normal to just be a factory worker? Okay, well then I would take issue with that being the normalization. But at the same time, I don't know, maybe I don't hold too much of my identity in my job. So I don't know, I'm thinking out loud here, but it's this idea of normalization is a threat to a lot of people today. Even though that normal is really actually what continues the human race. Families having children, living in a way that men and women expose their male and female children to men and women in a safe relationship, and also it's that's unheard of nowadays.
Yeah, and you can't get through life without having a whole set of what we might call assumptions, although that makes it sound too rational, and it's not. It's often pre-rational, or what thinkers used to call prejudicial prior to judgment. That my interaction with this person is not going to be a violent one, right? I mean, that's an assumption that we make constantly throughout the day, even though it never kind of comes to the conscious level of your thinking, almost never. That if I make an exchange with this person, then they're going to give me what they promised. I'm going to give them what they promised, right? That has to be the norm for even people to engage in such exchanges. So if you kind of dissolve all sense of normalcy, then you you dissolve what it means to live a human life.
Well, and civilization, I think, ultimately, that what does it even mean to be civilized is to have those pre-rational things that I can just be like, oh, my neighbor is not going to just try and kill me and take my stuff. We were texting the other day, and we made a joke about the all versus all Hobbesian kind of thing. It's like, well, we don't have that. Why do we not have that? Because we've worked really hard as a human race to really, truly, from a Christian inheritance, not do that.
We're still relatively a high trust society, even though that's changing and has been changing. It's not since 2020 or whatever. But it's been changing for decades, going on a century now. Just a fact I can't get out of my head when I think about these things is how there are certain communities in the United States, wide ranges geographically, that in the late 19th, early 20th century that didn't have locks on their doors. They just didn't need them. Like you might look at other parts of the world where they might not have doors, because of the way that the landscape works. It doesn't make sense. You can't have those elements of an arrangement of the way you would say build a house, presume a certain level of trust of your neighbor. Now you don't leave anything unlocked. How many levels of security do you have on those devices that you carry on your person?
Two-step verification.
Yeah, for everything. So it's not that we're low trust. We're not, right? There are places in the world that are low trust, and if anybody who would go to them would see immediately as different.
Yeah.
But we are getting there, and you might think that film has had a role to play in that. Not to be, I don't want to come off as like sounding, like it's all bad or whatever, because I actually love. I should have started with I'm someone who really enjoys film and likes to participate in it. But what some really great thinkers were worried about in the latter half of the 20th century was they were seeing the erosion of trust between neighbors, people who have nothing in common except for kind of a common American or maybe state identity or rough geographical location. They don't know each other. This erosion of trust between them. So, for instance, Karl Popper, really massive thinker in the 20th century, gave an interview toward the end of his life in the early 90s where he laid the responsibility for this erosion of trust squarely at the feet of film and showing, because you're showing, for instance, like say a relatively innocent show. My wife and I are watching Monk right now, right?
Oh yeah,
pretty good, charming, very funny,
procedural.
Yeah, but every episode there's a murder that's shown typically at the beginning of the episode, and it's explicit. Like often you see the guy stab the guy or a man strangle a woman or whatever, and they try and get creative with it. And oftentimes, to make the mystery a little bit more interesting, it's like a victim you wouldn't expect, and it's also a perp you wouldn't expect.
Yeah. So
if I'm watching this every day for 9 years, or every week for 9 years, however long the show lasted, I'm informing myself to think like, oh, this seemingly upstanding guy could be,
that's
a
true.
knifer, or I don't know, like he could. It's not implausible to think that it could make you just a generally more suspicious person.
Of course. I will confess, I think this is a pretty benign group to try and say this about. I've seen The Sopranos. I don't recommend it. It's full of violence and sex.
I feel like I've seen The Sopranos through you because I've never seen it. I've heard you talk about it so much.
And he just won't shut up about it. No, but it made me afraid of Italians.
I love you make me want to watch it.
That's funny. I should really dial up how much I think it's not good to watch. Okay, I'm saying it. Do not watch The Sopranos if you're a Christian. Okay, this was before I had these ideas in my head. It made me afraid of Italians. Because the Italian hitman would come over.
Is that why you didn't like me for so long?
Oh, yeah. It's the Italian.
You wouldn't talk to me.
Oh, man. He's going to shoot me in the head. But no, I mean, so many times in the show, there'd be like, they brought over this hitman from Italy, and he'd be like, oh, no, excuse me. And he'd just shoot you and walk away. And it would just be the most cold-blooded thing that it's hard to watch.
Right.
And so I'm not actually afraid of Italians. Right. Okay, I married an Italian. I had to overcome my fear, but it's not unheard of, and I think it tracks with just that alone. Like, that's a goofy example, but it works. Like,
yeah, it is weird to think about how normal it is in at least in our cinematic experiences to see cold-blooded betrayals of another human being. For most people. So here's an example. Knifing someone is actually really hard to do. There are studies in the moral psychology lab at Harvard related to this.
They're just stabbing people over there?
Well, I think that what they did the study on is on pulling the trigger on someone, even simulating it. But it's a well-known fact of history that like plunging a blade into another person, even if they are
trying to kill you.
Horrible, like a horribly evil person that you have nothing but contempt for. It's hard to do because there's just this aversion towards, plunging the blade into another human being. There's an episode in one of my favorite novels, Lewis's Do We Have Faces, where it's fiction, but Lewis is very historically informed and he knew what he was talking about. There's a duel, and it's the Queen's first duel. And she's trying to avoid war with the duel. So her general or her captain has her slaughter a pig with the sword she's going to duel with first. She has to know what it feels like and have kind of broken through that first barrier of plunging a blade into living flesh before she does it to someone where the stakes are really high.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't. It's kind of a weird, surprising fact. You wouldn't really think about it because it's something that we secondhand experience all the time in our media experiences. And I don't know a whole lot about. I'm not going to sit pound the table and say like you can never show knife wounds created on film, but we should at least assume that it's going to affect us in some way. That's where the default should be.
And there are completely tasteful ways and a lot of examples, 100 years of examples of classic films that do that without being explicit.
Right.
And The Shadow is a perfect example of stabbing. You see the violence through shadow.
Yeah.
And even that can be really effective.
Yeah. I wonder if the way blocking worked on the stage and if that
informed that.
Which it has to be less violent because you're not really stabbing people.
Yeah.
And you're hiding.
You got to get the blade under the armpit.
Yeah. Or like when you hit somebody, you hit their hand.
Yeah.
And, you never see the strike happen. And that translates to those earlier films.
That it's almost like wrestling, the kayfabe thing, the kayfabe, like, which is basically we all agree that it's fake and it's okay.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
The showmanship of it.
Yeah.
That it's like, it's just a facsimile of violence rather than.
Yeah, but I don't want to lose. I don't want to miss out on an important point to make by focusing too much on blood, because that's something, or like wounds, which is something people care a lot about, and that has its place for conversation. But violence transcends that insofar as typically what we mean by violence is when someone inflicts it on another.
Yes.
Right.
But
and that's more than just someone causing physical harm to someone else.
Yeah.
There's a moral dimension to that encounter. It's another human being. It's another person who has that kind of a life, a world, an inner life, and so on, who is willing to kind of maybe look away from the value, the worth of the other person, if you will, to end their life.
Yeah.
One of my favorite lines from any movie ever is in Unforgiven, when Clint Eastwood says, it's a hell of a thing killing a man.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. You take away all he's got and all he's ever gonna have.
Which is, I think, a very acute way to illustrate the gravity of what it means to harm someone else. Yeah. Not to say it's never permissible. I don't think that's true. It sometimes might even be obligatory.
Mm-hmm.
But that it's a grave thing.
It is, yeah.
And so sometimes I think we can get maybe a little bit too concerned about, well, was there blood? That's going to make the difference between R and PG-13 or something like that.
Yeah, well, sure. There's a lot of like studio funding type things where it's like, if we can keep it PG-13, we can hit the 4-quadrant demographic and kids will see it, or parents will take their kids, that kind of thing. Parents won't take, I don't know about nowadays. I don't hear anything about ratings nowadays.
Yeah.
I know that this still happens, but it seems almost quaint in the streaming age and in the...
I wonder if that's just because something's PG doesn't mean... Like, no, I don't trust it just because it's PG.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, even back in the day, PG was... It was like G and PG were the only ratings way back in the day.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's you could still see, side boob and stuff like that in like Tarzan films.
Right.
And that's even Hays Code era type stuff. But some of that is like one-offs. But I actually kind of want to, we brought up violence at this point, so we can jump into what I have here about violence.
Okay.
And we've covered a good bit of it already, but I'll start with this. Remarking on violence in his films, director Jean-Luc Godard put it this way. He said, "It's not blood, it's red." What do you make of this distinction?
Well, I've never heard that quote, and I don't want to be uncharitable. It sounds to me like the context of it is trying to get the viewer to reimagine what they're seeing. Let's say, a shot goes off and it strikes someone, and there's a crime scene afterward, and it's a big puddle. It sounds like what he's saying is it's not blood, it's red.
That is, yeah. It was a critic or an interviewer really kind of grilling him for the level of violence in some of his films in the 60s.
Yeah.
And so I think he's having maybe a little too detached from it,
Yeah.
But it makes sense because the idea I think that I take away from it a lot is that it isn't actually violent. Unlike sex, like simulated sex on screen.
I see.
There's a dimension to that where it's like, of course, the actual effect and what I'm trying to impart on the audience, that's bad. Just seeing heads get chopped off and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I'm not actually chopping off heads.
Right.
So there's a level of like, well, the crew and the storyteller might not be sinning necessarily, but you see what I mean?
I do, yeah. That's an interesting distinction. Like, simulated sexual activity is sexual activity for most people.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know a lot of actors. It'd be interesting to see what they have to say about this.
Yeah.
Like how they think about it. Although, it's a sexual experience. It seems to me very implausible to deny that.
You're talking about something explicit on screen, like we're simulating it, we're making out, we're doing the whole,
Whereas simulated violence isn't always violence. I mean, of course it could be. Like in the case of, pro wrestling, it's just like toned down.
Yeah, that's true.
You pull the punches.
Yeah.
Right. But when it's blocked, it's not. So that is an interesting distinction. I have two things to say about that quote, though. The first, the thing that strikes my mind is who cares about red? Red splatter.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to the theater to watch red splatter.
That's true.
There's nothing interesting about that.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you just have obscure curiosities with color theory or whatever.
Well, this is French New Wave, so they were messing with narrative and all sorts of stuff. So it's possible that somebody could be like, oh, I just, their characters are painted, their faces are painted in weird scenes and stuff like that. So it's like, all right, shut up. That's kind of shut up.
Yeah.
But
that goes outside my sort of realm of ability to reason
not a normal,
about it.
Going back to normalization, it's not a normal viewer is going to be like, let me put it
But
on
in terms of narrative film fiction,
yes,
right? Blood is not just red splatter. Blood is this. It's the clearest representation of life that we have. So when it's spilt, that's a representation of life that's been end it. And I think that it's asking people to deny something that's pretty importantly wired into us as humans to reject that in their responses. Maybe people can get to the point where they see someone cut open, the blood come out, and they don't think of it as that way. They don't think of it as life spilt. But that actually would worry me. That seems like a kind of desensitization.
Yeah, at least there's like a hyper niche type thing with horror filmmakers, horror audience people. Where they like the gore, the kind of Play-Doh effect of George Romero's zombies, where people get bitten and it's like huge stretchy pieces of skin.
Yeah.
And it's like obviously unreal,
right?
But they're into it for the kind of schlocky special effects of it. But the more realistic it becomes, like Saw, or Hostel. That's not enjoyable to watch. And if you enjoy watching that, like, I mean, I'm sorry if you do, but like if you've gotten to the point where you see that and it doesn't faze you at all, I would think if you're interested in it, it probably does not faze you.
Yeah.
Like, but I would.
It's interesting to make this distinction is interesting between people who clearly don't see something as real, and I know what you're talking about. I've seen it myself, where there's like an extreme level of violence. But the fun of it is almost that we're all
that it's not
pretending.
real.
Yeah, but I wonder. I mean, this is me just speculating. I wonder what's really going on there, and if it is to some level, because you think of a more sensitive person, as we would put it, wouldn't be able to see that except for as like a human getting their intestines eaten by a zombified human being.
Yeah.
Whereas, us veteran zombie watchers, we're like, oh no, it's just actors,
Yeah.
It doesn't feel real to us at all.
Yeah.
Because
that's a bad thing. You've lost the ability to turn away.
Now, I don't want to be pounding the table about that point.
Same, yeah.
But I do want to just raise it, because I don't think we even think about it. That we might be just like deluding ourselves about the significance of these things that we participate in, which raises the second thing I wanted to say, which is what it means to participate in narrative film fiction. I think oftentimes we underestimate the extent to which we're invested in a world. My favorite way to express this point is in Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, where he outlines this category of second belief. So it's somewhere between just straightforward belief. You kind of have this basic sense of what it means to believe something. You probably act according to it. If somebody asks you if you believe it, you'll say yes. There's various signs of ordinary belief. And then there's pretend, where there's kind of never even any question. You don't even really forget. You're pretending. And second belief is somewhere in between, where you really believe it. But it's kind of an as-if type posture. You're acting as if you believed it, right? But you don't really believe there are elves and hobbits and dwarves or whatever in the ordinary sense. But you are invested in this experience that requires you to adopt a mindset as if you believed it. And so this kind of as if posture ends up being a resemblance of ordinary belief. That's the ordinary belief is the paradigm against which it's defined. And so you can't just say, well, it's fake. It's just actors. The actors aren't really cutting each other's heads off. Well, no, I mean, that's obviously true, unless it's Ben-Hur, right, or whatever.
Yeah. Somebody actually gets killed on screen, you mean?
Yeah. But almost always it's not actually, or Milo Notice, apparently.
Did they actually kill animals in Milo
Notice?
Yeah,
I don't know if this is true.
Are you a big Milo Notice head like
dude,
me?
We love Milo Notice.
I love Milo Notice.
Yeah, we regularly watch it.
Gotta take a walk outside.
But people have speculated a bunch of cats died in the making of the film. I've not been able to confirm it. I tried looking it up.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Most of the time, though, people are not harmed, right? But that's not the point. The point is that you are entering into a space, a kind of alternative reality, voluntarily, as if that space were real.
That's true.
And so there is a kind of secondary way in which it is real. And you should, and this is the important thing for my purposes, I suppose, is that you should be wondering what you're doing to yourself when you are inhabiting a space where you're asked to simulate the experience of a murder over and over and over again. Or to see the human form to be mutilated or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Kind of on that point, you've done some research on how much exposure we have to that type of thing. And we were talking the other day about that. Can you walk us
just
through
a little bit? Yeah, I mean, this is an old finding. I've not been able to find any updated stats on this, but from 1998, the American Psychiatric Association estimated, based off of children that they were studying, that the average American child, before they, regardless male or female, before they reach the age of 18, witnesses over 16,000 simulated murders. Not even just deaths, but murders.
Wow.
On screen before they reach the age of 18. Now that's 1998, so that's a pretty old stat. There's a temptation to just be like, oh, it's got to be worse. Now, I actually don't know if that's true, because sometimes film is weird like that. Like you get these ebbs and flows of what.
Well, their exposure to things back in the day would have had to have been movies. How do they calculate this number? That comes into question.
Yeah.
Are we counting like a tidal wave hits a city? Okay, that estimated population of New York that's been wiped out in the Armageddon movie. It's like
no. I think it's like you see the person.
Yeah, and that's fair.
You either see their right.
But there is some question about that. But also, it was more communal back then. You had to go somewhere or be around the family TV. I guess you could have had a TV set in your room in 1998 and been old enough to just watch whatever was on TV. But now it's in your pocket. I have my mom's iPad. You know, I'm probably seeing way worse things than people being simulated, like being murdered in a fake way. You know what I mean? But we have parental locks on things. It might even out. I don't know. But probably not. I actually feel like people see more actual people die nowadays.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah,
that does happen. I mean, it's basically if someone dies or is murdered in an interesting way, it's in public. It's going to be filmed, and if it's filmed, it's there for you to see it.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I observed a real death recorded was. ISIS was throwing their weight around the Middle East, and it was like their first come to power in the summer of 2014. At least the first time we were given attention to it, and they had taken over some monastery. I don't remember where it was now, and they filmed the what they did to the clergy that were in the monastery, and I did the thing that you do on YouTube where you like. You start a video and you just start like skipping to the middle, and I wasn't thinking, and I like started this video and I didn't want to watch someone get murdered. I just kind of wanted to know what was going on. There's probably a little bit of vice of what the medieval moralists would have called the vice of curiosity, knowledge that's not really important for you to know. It's and I just kind of clicked on up somewhere in the middle of the whatever that bar is called on the playback thing, and it was like in the middle of an act, and I remember vomiting.
Wow.
I was in the library at the university of my hometown, and I went to the bathroom and I threw up.
Wow.
Because it was so disturbing to me, and I don't go looking for this kind of thing. I don't remember the last time I saw anything like it, but it is more normal now. I mean, even with stuff going on around the world, you'll see pictures, maybe even images of corpses and so on.
And YouTube is better about it now. I think back in the day, you could easily, there's no warning, but now it's like, oh, do you have to be 18? Are you sure you want to watch this?
Yeah.
At least trying to stop you a little bit. But yeah, a lot of the riot violence happening several years ago, that was a big thing. Just, you don't know if these people are dead.
Right.
They're getting run over by cars and stuff like that.
There's multiple levels of analysis here, because there's like the brute image of violence, which can sometimes be at least good for some purpose, right? There's the famous Emmett Till picture.
Yeah.
Right, which the open casket funeral, which Rosa Parks said, I've heard she said that it was in her mind when she refused to go to the back of the bus. There's just the brute image, and then there is like the phenomenon of killing someone, which is what I'm more concerned about.
Yeah.
I'm not like interested in telling people they can't watch their favorite war films anymore, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That's a whole context. There's a genre built around context that
Yes.
obviously we got good guys, bad guys, or maybe we don't know if they're good or bad, but they're clearly at war.
Yeah. But what I mean, I'll just throw this out here. What I get a little bit nervous about, to be frank, is the apparently increasing phenomenon of like building excuses to then just have rampant bloodshed. So the villains are Nazis or slaveholders, or they killed someone's dog or whatever it is, and then you could just like do whatever
you want
to them. And I don't know how you would go about measuring this, but at least we should be willing to consider whether or not this is driven. This is like a market supply to the demand to satisfy our bloodlust.
Yeah.
Which we just might have more of it than we'd like to admit.
Probably. Yeah, probably. There's a little bit of henchmanism where it's like you just create Ultron has created his army of gray CGI bad guys. That's one thing. But it's another thing to be like, okay, or even aliens or something non-human, even though they're humanoid. But I get what you're getting at. Like,
yeah. Can I notice a difference?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Here? That's a good point. So there's just like there's the henchman phenomenon. But I think that maybe what I'm a little bit more concerned about. So oftentimes with these action films, the attention will be like on how awesome the action star is, right? What I'm more concerned about is the opportunity for the protagonist to just kind of like let loose rage. And so it's not so much of like, look how well trained, this fighter is and how capable and competent he is, which we're kind of all attracted to, right? It's look at the damage that can be done if you just like let loose. And I think what might be going on a lot of times in these cases is maybe a certain degree of catharsis, because you're asked to inhabit the space again.
For sure.
And oftentimes you identify with the protagonist. So it's like as if you were allowed to just kind of
Yeah.
do whatever you want.
Classic example, my family's been killed, I can kill anyone.
Yeah, you could do whatever you want to whomever you want.
Now, I'll push back just a little bit. Paralandra. Ransom gives in to killing the unman. That's good. And it's framed completely, without excuse, that he's just like, oh, wait, I can just kill evil.
Yeah, but do you remember what the narrator says about that desire, that pleasure?
It's like the axe in the tree.
I don't remember that.
Maybe I'm getting that wrong.
Okay, so
but he's saying like the satisfaction of just like he could not let go, but just that he could finally, it's what it was made for.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's the axe in the tree. It's made to cut down the tree. And he's like, okay.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So Ransom, I don't know how much we need to set that up, this up.
You could give us a little more context.
Ransom, the protagonist, he's trying to protect somebody from this guy called the Unman through debate. And then he just realizes, I just got to kill the guy.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of where it goes. And they start the fight. And the narrator describes that Ransom felt an extreme and surprising amount of pleasure and joy in the feeling of wailing on this guy, the feeling of like thwarting out, stamping out evil. But it says Ransom then felt a feeling that I think it might have been probably or perhaps no man could feel on earth from his world without sin.
Yeah, okay, I do remember that.
So there is a qualification there.
That's fair.
And Lewis is saying something, I think, about our world in our experience, right? Where there is an appropriate level of joy in destroying evil, fighting evil, and doing so with great competence and ability. There's also the famous example from The Lord of the Rings when Theoden leads the Rohirrim into the battle on Pelennor Fields, and it says they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was upon them, and all the singing was heard in the city. It's really interesting because that actually might be like really disturbing to people.
Yeah,
in our day.
There's a Churchill quote from one of his diaries. He's in Africa somewhere during one of the Boer Wars, and he says that he knew he was on the losing side when he heard them singing hymns. and he's just like got the spine tingle of just like, oh,
Yeah.
are we the baddies? And of course they're singing psalms. And I haven't read Lord of the Rings Confession, but I imagine they're singing something to the same effect.
Yeah, and it's expression of unity among these fellow countrymen in this common goal, and you just can't.
Mm-hmm.
You can't stand against that unless you have an equal force to oppose it, I suppose. I think a lot of people would be disturbed by that point. So this is a good kind of test case, but I do think Lewis's qualification is important to suggest at least that all the parts have to be in the right place. The motive has to be exactly right and pure. The end has to be good.
There's a lot of clarity there that makes it difficult to tell different types of stories.
Right. And in that context of that story, just to put a bow on this point, it's according with the just war tradition, which says that warfare has to be the last resort. Mm-hmm. It's the last resort. It's Ransom's last resort.
Trying to debate this guy.
Right.
We have a lot of pet conversations, I think, about trying to adapt Paralandra, but there's a lot of issues. That's a whole other episode podcast. But
adapt out of the Sun Planet.
Yeah,
it'd be a way cooler movie, I think.
Oh, really?
Because it's all visual.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you got this awesome point right in the halfway mark, which is the shark hunt or the Hanakra hunt.
Yeah.
And Ransom earns his badge among the Harassa because he slays a shark, and has his friend. I'll spoiler alert. As his friend lay dying from a gunshot, he points to Ransom's heart and says, "Hanakra punt."
Yeah.
You're one of us.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's true. For those who don't know and gotten this far and you don't realize what we're talking about, it's C.S. Lewis's space trilogy.
Yeah.
Out of the Silent Planet, which is what you were just talking about, Paralandra, the second one, and then That Hideous Strength, which if you want like really accurate cultural commentary, That Hideous Strength right now is like just
absolutely
right on the money.
Yeah.
I just wish it was less boring.
Yeah. I mean, I'd put Brave New World beside it as well.
Of course, yeah. We live in you've seen the Venn diagrams of like, what dystopia do we live in? And it's like all the overlapping ones. It's like, this is where you're at. Brave New World and 1984 and That Hideous Strength too. But to kind of drill down on the violence thing, and then we can move on from this. Can violence be funny? Like, can it be employed in a humorous way? Or do you feel like as a filmmaker, it couldn't be? Kind of gets back to what you're saying about the henchmanism. Like, we're just totally dehumanize these people. Examples, films like Shaun of the Dead.
There's the question as to whether or not it can be funny, and then there's a question whether or not, regardless of its
I think it can
humor,
be funny. That's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
It can be funny.
Should you laugh at it?
Should I laugh? Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Should it be employed by the filmmaker to make people laugh?
Yeah.
And I guess we got to make the distinction of violence, like Three Stooges, running around hitting each other, versus I'm blowing someone's head off and that's funny. That's probably over the line.
I don't think that I don't think I can say honestly that I believe that it's never appropriate, right? With a lot of these things that we've been talking about, they're not absolutes here.
Yeah.
I mean, the law against murder is an absolute, but the law is against representations of murder and so on.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit more judgment. So I'm not going to say I think it can never be.
Yeah, I think
appropriate.
As Christians, we're one to rush to trying to have a really firm line on things, and that's where we divide. The Christian cringe people are like, we won't suffer any image of murder in any way. Our films are going to be milquetoast conversations where everyone believes in the Bible and blah 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 on board. And then the Christian fartistry people are like, well, let's just rip up bodies and we don't care.
Right.
And, it's just vice unleashed.
It becomes indulgent.
Exactly. Indulgency is a huge component to that.
But I often think, and to introduce this concept, I often think that humor at the expense of someone's life can be a death work in film, where the point is that the humor trades on the transgression of the value of human life. And it seems to me, I could be wrong about this, I'm willing to be persuaded, but it seems to me that it often comes from a place of bitter cynicism, a kind of deconstructive
nihilist
worldview. I think of the example in in what's that zombie movie with Woody Harrelson and Zombieland?
Zombieland, yeah.
Where the mom abandons the kid party because they've all turned into zombies. So the viewer has already processed bad mom, right? Because she's just out for herself. She's not at all like concerned for these children who just turned into zombies. And then she immediately gets in a car crash but wasn't wearing her seatbelt. She gets flung through the windshield and to her death. And it shows it, all of it.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be funny. And that when I think about something like that, that seems to me what is going on there about how you're supposed to find humor in this. It seems to be like somebody getting their comeuppance, maybe a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's a comeuppance is definitely
the person getting their comeuppance is somebody who you would typically think of as an upstanding person, very normal, middle class, suburban, responsible, a parent.
Yeah, and she's going against the thing that she's been doing.
Drives a minivan, but it's all facade because when it comes down to it, she's just out for herself.
Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of thing, like again, without going into like you must never do any this or that as a filmmaker.
Just think about that more.
Yeah. Like what is it that you're asking of your?
That's true. That's a really good question. Yeah, and you can apply that just level of analysis to any joke. And you start drilling down. It's like, what is actually supposed to be funny about this? But I want to double back because you just used the term death work.
Yeah.
Define death work for me. We can jump into this.
Yeah. So death work is a work of art, or perhaps some part of a primary or a privileged aspect of a work of art, where that trades on the transgression of an established cultural norm. That's very important it's like an operating established cultural norm that kind of dominates the patterns of behavior, the norms of thinking of that culture. And so I was suggesting that some black comedy death could be death work because the point is to kind of surprise you and how callous and cruel it is and how callous and cruel you are in finding it funny. There are all sorts of examples of death works. It doesn't. Most of the time, they don't have anything to do with violence
or death.
Or death.
I mean, I guess there's on a broader sense, it's the death of the moral framework.
Exactly. Yeah, the death that you're killing the culture.
Yeah, the acid that we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, for sure.
Yeah. So I mean,
we talked about Seinfeld being a death work because I made a Seinfeld quote, and you were like, "Why? That's a death work." And
I don't remember what joke that was.
I was quoting an episode where George comes up with a comeback, and he re-engineers a scenario to have the same comeback happen again, where he's eating all this shrimp, and this guy in his office is like, "Hey, George, the ocean called. They're running out of shrimp."
I'm gonna just put a monitor on the skybox.
Hey, George, the ocean called. They're running out of shrimp.
And the whole episode he spends like trying to re-engineer that scenario. Like he eats a ton of shrimp in front of the guy to get him to use his line.
Well, the jerk store called. They're running out of you.
What's the difference? You're their all-time bestseller.
Anyway, it's great. It's great writing on a technical sense, on a craft sense, like the way they weave in at all these jokes. And Kramer comes in, Jerry comes in. They all give their ideas of what he should have said.
Right.
And George is like too dumb to think of any of these things. But it's a great episode. But you're saying Seinfeld is a death work really stuck with me because I love that show. I'm Seinfeld over Friends for sure. Like Friends is definitely a death work. No argument there. Dead on arrival. But Seinfeld, I thought about it, I agree with you. Every episode, Jerry and George spend bedding different women,
right,
and then breaking up with them,
right,
for various minor things, which is funny. Should it be funny? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a death work because it hits at the idea that men and women should be monogamous and that the family structure, and so it's just flippant,
or that it's normal.
Yeah.
That it might be treating things that at the time, I mean, I was a really little kid when this was coming out, so I don't really know what was normal, but it was, in a way, maybe like a cultural trolling where it's asking people to act like something is normal when it's not normal. Yeah. And I think maybe the point about Seinfeld being a death work, if there is a point to be made here, and the fans of if you have any fans of Philip Reef in your audience, they can correct me if I'm wrong in the application of this. I'm not a Reef scholar, but I've done a bit of reading on him lately. Very brilliant.
He's the one who coined the term.
Yeah, he coined the term, and he has the book "My Life Among the Death Works," where he goes through various works of art and talks about how the death works and so on, and kind of elaborates on the concept. The reason I think that Seinfeld might be a death work is that it's intentionally, like its whole bit is that it's uniquely trying to dissolve the concept of order in narrative and resolution. And
that it's about nothing.
Yeah. And so that you get the sequence of events, but it's not clear how they make a whole all the time. That probably would not have been normal.
Well, that's what it was known for in terms of.
Yeah.
I actually do think Larry David and Jerry do a great job of tying a bow at the end of every episode. There's kind of spiritual successors like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where it just kind of ends sometimes with pie on everybody's face. It's like, and sometimes I think they're pretty good about them not getting away with it at the end.
Yeah.
I think that's something that helps bolster it against it being a death work, is that like at the end of Seinfeld, they end up in jail for being bad people.
Right.
So society rails back against them. And so that's a commentary on the show itself. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons.
And you had Monty Python before that would end their bits
Totally.
with just the whacking each other in the head stuff. And so, I mean, nothing, you can always find the earlier example of things. But anyway, I'm not going to die on the hill of Seinfeld being a death work.
But yeah, that's fair. It's a funny death work.
Well, and that raises the point that, I mean, Reef didn't intend for the concept to always be a more operation. It's not always wrong to be a death work. He was actually a big fan of some literary works. I think Finnegan's Wake is an example of one by James Joyce that he considered death works, and he really liked them. So I mean, it's another question of like, what should I watch this? Should I read this?
Yeah.
Or should I go to the art gallery?
I think it's just a really helpful category and distinction to have for Christian filmmakers to be like, am I making a death work?
Yeah.
What am I actually trying to get at? And actually, to that point, does Reef go into lifeworks at all? And is anything a life work?
Yeah. Well, what would a life work be?
Something that bolsters the moral framework.
Well, I would imagine a life work would be more than just maintaining a status quo. But it would be like resurrecting some. So you're trying to change the culture through the erosion of the status quo.
That's death work,
right? That'd be a death work. But then you have the status quo. It's just like you have, I don't know, just something that is. It's not really pushing the boundaries. That doesn't make it not a classic. A Jane Austen novel.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Very emblematic of its time. Maybe literature people might be like, oh, she was radical of her time. I doubt it, but maybe we're on the edges. She's kind of like pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
But for the most part, she's like a good example of someone who is trying to make the norms and customs, or the best of the norms and customs of her time, intelligible to the reader, and see ways in which we execute them poorly and well and so on. A life work, I suppose, would be where you're not just trying to see through something you don't like, right, and destroy it, but that you're trying to actually, you're trying to show, to help your neighbors see something that is real, that maybe is not normal for them or people in your culture to see.
It sounds extremely hard to do, and it sounds cringy.
Yeah.
Because you think Christian cringe, it's like, well, I'm just going to show you that praying and giving you a Bible verse is something that you don't normally do, and it's great.
Yeah. Well, I actually think that, and it might be cringy to use these examples, but you actually might think of Lewis and Tolkien falling in these categories, because what's unique about it, I mean, nobody was doing what they were doing at the level that they were doing it, and at the level of literacy, seriousness, and so on. And both of those authors are often championed with, well, one of the reasons they're so beloved is that they made the heart and soul, the kind of heartbeat of a certain medieval worldview clear to a modern audience.
They are re-enchanters.
So you might call it like a resurrection work. Is that cringy enough for you?
Oh, yeah, that's pretty cringy. Life work sounds better. But there's that sense of re-enchantment. It's giving me these things. It's like, I can love my mom and dad, and I don't need to run away from them to realize who I am. Kind of going back to the the Star Wars thing
Yeah.
you're talking about. Like, I can love my family.
Yeah.
And that's just a genuine thing. And I thought in terms of a modern word that people is synonymous maybe with DeathWorks is deconstruction. So like giving you a deconstructed Batman or Superman or Indiana Jones, these characters who were like amazing, heroic in their own right. Luke Skywalker. Now we have to give them, we're seeing through
You
the
mean
Luke
that he's
Skywalker.
been deconstructed?
Yeah.
So what's the deconstruction of Luke? You're talking about
In Force Awakens.
yeah, what's the
Or whatever the next one is, Last Jedi.
I'm not going to defend those movies.
Me neither. Those movies are trash.
I mean, I would say it's character assassination.
It is.
But my understanding of the way I think of deconstruction is that you peel back the layers of a person's behavior and motivations to where you find their kind of driving force, and it ends up being self-interested
That's
in a
fair.
way that makes all of the apparent behavior inauthentic.
Yeah.
And unreal in a sense.
Yeah. Been a while since I've seen those new Star Wars movies. I can't remember if Luke really is formally deconstructed. You're right. Character assassination might be a better thing, where it's just showing him acting in ways that is not really true to who he is. But it's not like revealing how he was in the past and being like, I actually just wanted power the whole time. That would be more of a formal deconstruction, is what you're saying.
So how open are you to spoilers?
Oh, very. Yeah.
So we've talked about Fallout.
Yeah. Yes.
So
yes. We both. Yes.
most of the characters in Fallout are deconstructed.
Yes. There's Titus. I can't remember his real name.
Yeah,
but he goes
and
by
the
Titus.
institution that he's a part of.
Yeah,
The
all of them
clergy
start
and
out
so
in
on.
institutions
Yeah.
and then end up becoming disenchanted.
Right. Lucy's dad.
Lucy's dad. Oh, he's actually the bad guy. There was all that coming.
Which is, I mean, it's a bit on the nose because he, in a way, he's her reason to be in the story. He is her. You know, he represents the reason she has to live.
Yes,
like, the
and
meaning
for
of
those
her
who
life.
don't know what we're talking about, I imagine most people do, but Amazon TV show called Fallout, based on a famous video game series where we follow a vault dweller. So in the future, nuclear war has destroyed the world. It's a post-apocalyptic society, but these people lived in these vaults underground. That's Lucy, our main character, and they're kind of Mormon-esque.
Yeah.
You know, clean, happy people.
Right.
And then you have the people above ground. There's this ghoul guy who was an actor back in the day before the bombs dropped, and then this Titus fellow who is part of a kind of militaristic Iron Man type regime that goes around and I guess cleans up town. I don't know. They have kind of a priest clergy class that rules them too. But
his whole thing is that he has become a knight. He was a squire to a knight who's killed, and he puts on the armor, which goes against the code. It's like a capital offense in their order. But he's like, I'm going to prove myself, because he believes so much in this institution that he thinks they will see my valiance. Like they'll see me
and they'll
be
honor
what
me.
and they'll honor and they'll accept it. And of course they don't.
Yeah, he's a code breaker.
Yeah, there's the one clergyman who's like, I'm going to start a new group at the end, and he realizes that it's all fake, and they're issues about power. It's about control.
Yes.
At the same time that Lucy realized her father nuked a working town.
And then I guess the ghoul kind of, we already meet him.
Yeah.
Totally deconstructed.
Which is why you root for him.
Yeah, that's right.
Because he's cynical, just like all of us.
He's cynical, exactly, and he's lawless and just does what we want him to do, killing people. I don't recommend the show. Neither do you, from what it sounds like.
Yeah.
But it is a good example of characters who become disenchanted over time.
Yeah. I wouldn't. I mean, it's so normal though that I wouldn't even call something like that a death work, because
That's true.
I wonder if
That's
the
true.
writers even know that
they don't.
Yeah,
they don't.
I'm pretty sure like my grandmas would be like the only people that would be disturbed.
Probably at this point, yeah. It's the air we breathe.
Yeah.
We breathe DeathWorks, and that's what's the DeathWorks have outstripped the supply of the moral framework that they're trying to dissolve.
Right.
And so that's what makes them so redundant and dumb at this point. Like, I can applaud you for executing in a good way, whatever. Something, it's not actually beautiful, it's not actually good, but in a technical way, you made a good film that told your audience that, religion sucks or whatever. Wow. But because that same thing can be used to a better end, right?
Just like Angels and Demons, Da Vinci Code.
Oh, man.
Best movie of 2000. 2002 or whenever.
Yeah. Back when Tom Hanks was.
He had a string
of. His long-haired movies. I pretended to read that book in high school. I think it was before Spark Notes, and I somehow got an A on my project. Whatever.
Yeah.
That should tell you everything you need to know about Dan Brown. I can reconstruct your book as an 8th grader or whatever.
Yeah.
The death work thing, I find, again, to kind of double back, as a really useful category that I think would help a first-time filmmaker examine themselves and examine works. And it's a term that glitches people out. Like you tell them, I could tell you like, oh, I don't like The Sopranos because the sex and the violence. But then I could say, it's actually a death work. And it gives me way more pointed feedback to give. And then this new term, life work, however we determine that's supposed to be used in the future, but having a positive presentation or something, a moral framework. So let's see. I don't, for fear of wanting to double back too much on the violence thing, let's just hit sex and art and the moral philosophy behind that. Do you think sex and art are compatible at all? We've kind of talked about that just a little bit, like not really, and sort of depends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, historically, there's just a lot of sexuality in art.
Yeah.
So it's just implausible to say just a pat no, right? You can't.
Again,
right?
It's the gravitational pull of the Christian
I'm not going to
cringe.
go up against like every art historian known to man here on this.
Come on, man. Come on.
But I mean, is it appropriate? And that's the question. And I mean, this raises questions about the nature of sexuality that I think are may sound kind of weird and crazy, but you have to go there. Like, where does sexuality end, and this like non-sexual realm of life begin? Right? Does sexuality start at like clear, naked revelation of genitals or something like that?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? Well, that seems maybe arbitrary. Is it shapeliness? I mean, I suppose a safe rule of thumb to appeal to in the history of thinking about the virtues, especially in the Christian tradition, would be the concept of modesty, which is a sub header under the broader header of chastity.
Yeah.
So chastity is the virtue pertaining to virtue in sex, where your kind of drives, your desires, your actions with regard to sex are all according to God's design. Modesty, which is would be virtue in the realm of the signs of sex. And, one generally cleared on, a realm of signs of sexuality that are, outside the realm of lawfulness would be things designed or known to titillate.
Arouse.
Yeah, arouse. So, you should just stay away from that. Probably, it's sort of a boring recommendation, I suppose. But to think of modesty as in the service of chastity, because modesty is what you're dealing with as a filmmaker, right? Because, unless you're making pornographic films, which is a whole different. You shouldn't be doing that.
Yes. Listen to this podcast.
Right, but short of that, you're in the realm of modesty. If you're a serious filmmaker dealing with serious things that people's life face in their life, you're probably going to be, especially in our day and age, where so many young men are using porn and so many marriages are torn apart. It's going to be like something that you deal with in your film. The goal would be to refer to sex, to have signs of it in ways that you don't clearly foresee would lead the viewer to sin. Yeah. And then of course you shouldn't be encouraging any of the people on your sets to be doing anything.
Well, that's the thing too. As a Christian filmmaker, you would ideally, from behind the camera and on your set, you'd want something that doesn't lead your actors the same. Going back to what we were saying way before about how like simulated sex is sexual behavior. If my actors are married, I'm not going to make them do anything that they wouldn't do if I wasn't watching them with a camera.
Yeah. Right. And norms change with this, right? There's like that famous example of Philip Melanchthon, Martin Luther's disciple, observing Luther and von Bora's first night and saying it was very disturbing. But that was a common practice at the time. I mean, but it's clearly not in our time.
Yeah.
Right. So I think people just need to be, maybe a little bit more honesty would be the operative virtue here. Like, why are we doing this? And people can sense, to go back to a point in the ballpark of the death works, people can sense those edges that they would get something for transgressing. We're all kind of good at saying, like, oh, I'm the only guy in this crowd that is willing to use any language. Nobody in this circle of friends uses any language. Maybe I'll kind of push that boundary, and so I distinguish myself in using language. Well, I mean, regardless of your views on crude language, there's something kind of vainglorious about that.
Of course,
where you're just the drive is to distinguish yourself. Yeah, and I think that there needs to be more of a conversation getting back to the main principle behind what a filmmaker should be doing. So this dovetails nicely with the point about the Hays Code. You go read their descriptions and you're like, this was never going to last. Like, don't ever show clergy as corrupt. Don't ever show lawmen as corrupt. Pointed guns, blood. Like, it's almost laughable now that the idea that it was ever going to actually do anything to stop these things from making their way on.
There's a lot of really good stuff mixed in with just some goofy, like we said, the miscegenation type stuff, but like the destruction of the family, trying to preserve the moral order, that type of stuff I feel like is good natured and worth keeping. But but the
idea that you could just like make a list of rules and say, here are the rules, everybody follow it, is, I think, naive and a little bit misguided as to how we think. Like you need to change what people think they're doing. Like, what is their project?
I think that's exactly right. And it's trying to offer the negative position, a negative vision. Don't do, as opposed to offering the positive vision. Always do this.
Right.
Or,
and so what are the greatest commands as a Christian? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think it should be the forefront of every filmmaker's mind that film is, and to be exploring this idea that film is a distinctive way to love God's creation and to love the things that He's made, to love your neighbors, and to be kind of exploring the potentialities of the medium.
Raising your neighbor's moral affections or affections for a good moral behavior, that's going to help everybody. We're all in a room in terms of the antiquated movie theater, watching it kind of together and alone at the same time, but we can walk out both saying, like, family's good. I know it's one of the things that Miyazaki has said, his discontents with a lot of animation in the contemporary world, that it seems to be driven out of a hatred of other people and of the world, and that he tries to, not necessarily in a reactionary way, but his goal is that his works are an expression of love for his neighbor. Miyazaki's very muddled, I think, because I agree that is a good thing, and you get a warm feeling watching this 2D animation, which is an incredible art form. But then you get like good mixed with bad. There's no real bad guy. It's that kind of thing. So it's such a mixed bag with him where I'm like, I rock on, Miyazaki. Please do that. But can you tell something where somebody's actually bad?
Yeah, I mean, if that kind of lends itself to the idea that there is no such thing as bad, or that evil is an illusion, then that's a problem. But you might think, like most children's books, right? Some pretty good ones too. I don't know how much you
I have children. I partake.
Yeah. But they rarely have bad guys in them.
That's true.
And yet they're so gripping.
Or if the bad guy, they resolve in the end and they're friends. Like there's some misunderstanding or whatever it might be, that they come around, and that's the true triumph of evil, is to make them a brother and a sister.
Right.
That's, I think, mirrors what Christ does for us as enemies and
I think
friends.
It'd be an interesting task for a screenwriter to try and do, is to create a gripping a narrative where no one is a straight up villain, but the plot's still really, really gripping, and there's some sort of conflict resolution. It'd have to be like some sort of comedy of errors, like Much Ado About Nothing or something like that.
I'm sure
Except for there is the brother or whatever.
Yeah,
he's
there are definitely works that do that. I think dramas, a lot of comedies end up that way, like you said. Just it's really more misunderstanding. At the end, everyone's like, oh, haha. They come around in the end. But I just think that would make what Miyazaki is saying more clear.
Yeah.
And I would just like to see him do that. I haven't seen all of his work, so I don't know.
Have you seen Arrietty?
No, the one based on The Borrowers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't.
It's my favorite.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there is a clear villain in that one. I mean, I think it's clear. Yeah. I don't know what he would say. Oh, but I should say Miyazaki didn't make that one, so I guess it's Studio Ghibli, though.
Yeah.
But one of the characters is clearly a villain, but it doesn't dominate. It doesn't revolve around what this character is doing.
Okay.
But I take your point. I think that moral clarity and good versus evil is an important tool that the filmmaker should make use of.
Agreed.
But the point that I wanted to make is that a genuine love for your neighbor needs that question probed deeply and theologically and philosophically needs to be asked by any filmmaker or screenwriter that takes themselves seriously. Like, what does it mean to love other people? Is it just to listen to them, kind of like
let them do what they want,
to let them do what they want? Is it merely to kind of alleviate material burdens that they have, and so on? And those are all like very implausible perspectives on love that we're seeing the fruits of the failure. We're seeing the fruits of its failure in kind of the dissolution of the culture around our very eyes.
Yeah.
But once you get a clear grasp of what it means to love your neighbor, then kind of doing that through what you're able to show them and through your medium of film. That doesn't mean it has to be all happy-go-lucky.
No, of course not. You can use darkness and contrast it with void, where it's something, life isn't death. And you can do that very effectively. You don't have to be a cringy, everything is rubbery, good, clean, perfect. There's an intimate connection between like cruelty and mercy and getting people to want something good by showing them the bad. Good news, bad news kind of thing. The good news is that I got to tell you the bad news first, that you stand in judgment and that kind of thing. It's like there's something to do with that, where you're showing them the lack of the virtue that you want them to have in the end.
Yeah. So what it means to love your neighbor is going to depend on what you think is true.
Yes.
And this gets back to the GDB refrain that you don't have neutrality. So, for instance, there's a number of filmmakers who have an extremely, shall we say, pessimistic view of human nature in a way that sounds kind of like the Christian doctrine of original sin, but it's not. It'll be some kind of pseudo marriage of Freud and Darwin, right, where everything is about somehow it's about sex and survival at the same time. And that's kind of the springs of all of our action. And what does it mean to love your neighbor? If that's true, it might mean to make movies where you're revealing to them that that's really what they're like.
Yeah.
But if you don't believe that, we do have the doctrine.
Act in accordance to your true nature, which is just to eat your neighbor.
Yeah. What you really want is something. What it's all in, it's in all of us. Whereas the Christian doctrine of total depravity does say that mankind is prone to all manner of sin, right? But it doesn't say that each individual person is as bad.
It's not absolute
there's a little
depravity.
Cannibal,
It's total
a little
depravity.
Jeffrey Dahmer in you, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's actually not the doctrine.
Yeah.
And so you like, in other words, you're not going to be really getting your head around, I think, the questions that we're trying to address here without being a kind of lay theologian or philosopher, where you're doing metaphysics, you're doing anthropology, you're answering this question: what are humans? Why do they act? What are they looking for?
Yes.
Is there a nature? Is it constant?
That is the true DNA of filmmaking. If you don't understand those things, you're going to be muddled.
Yeah.
Your messaging's going to be muddled. Your stories are not going to be that great. I think if you can study these things, and that's actually the last question I have for you, is if somebody is interested in learning more about this stuff, who would you recommend they read or watch or listen to?
Yeah, so I would just say study the best of the Christian moral philosophical tradition, and that's both the philosophers and the theologians. Read widely, but try and aim for the good stuff. People I've been really influenced by that have really changed my outlook, that have informed this conversation in some tangible ways, are St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. Obviously, I have my kind of list of
go weird. Give me deep ones.
There's a really easy little book written in the 16th century that's trying to kind of summarize the Christian moral philosophical tradition up to his time, called On the Law of Nature by a Lutheran named Niels Hemmingsen. It's translated only recently, 2018. It's really good. It's really easy. It's the one I recommend. Like it's a lot easier than digging into the hard stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some pagans are pretty good on this too. Like Plato and Aristotle have been really influential in like what does it mean to how do our activities inform what we do?
What does it mean to be a good person?
Yeah, and they're wrong about a lot of these answers, but they do kind of lay out the general schema of the idea of a character.
Yes,
and that a character is that actions and emotions come from your character, and your character is informed by what you do. And this was
just good screenwriting advice.
Yeah,
character is action.
Yeah.
Is your character actually doing something?
Yeah. Right.
It's like, how does he choose to get to Chicago?
Yeah.
If he kills someone and takes their car, that's telling you everything you need to know about him.
Yes.
Versus,
and that's because what you do is a sign of who you are.
Yes.
Right. And then yet it also kind of informs who you are.
Yes.
And that general scheme was first clearly laid out in kind of a systematic treatment by Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
So, I mean, reading them with, I think, a Christian lenses.
And
is a good
having
idea
a
too.
heavy ballast of reading the Bible.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to read these pagans,
Absolutely.
that's how you're going to discern whether or not what they're saying is true or not, is you're going to have to refer to Scripture. And God's the arch storyteller, so he's going to tell you the true facts about human nature.
Yeah.
And reading his word is going to be the best way to understand what he thinks
Yeah,
about it.
and this would fall under the general charge of, like, we all need to be reading our Bible more seriously.
Yeah, I'm trying not to be like tropic about it.
Yeah,
It's like, read your Bible, that'll make you better. Of course, but yeah, to get the more philosophical pointedness and whatnot, I think that's a great recommendation. And to that point, I really appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. So
Yeah,
thanks.
I look forward to having you again soon. Thank you for listening to God Deserves Better, a production of Pemmican Studios.